Yossi. It's now being live streamed. And if you recall, last time we talked about the rainbow. Today, we're going to talk about another fascinating subject, I think, something that we don't often explore, but we're going to. It's a special Parsha for us because this is Ari's bar mitzvah Parsha. And most of the time when we discuss this Parsha, it's, of course, all about the Akedah. And if you recall, last time we were here, I did a share on Avram, the Mona Lisa, and the Akedah. Yeah, the singing didn't go that well for the famous song Mona Lisa, but we're going to talk about something different today, not touching upon the Akedah, and that is the story of Hagar. And it is really, I think, very, very fascinating. This kind of, let us say, in the movies, they call this a grade B actor. There are a lot of personalities in the Torah that we don't know too much about. They play an important role, and yet they're certainly not at center stage. Such a person is Hagar. And since we didn't meet last week in Parshat Lech Lecha, I'm glad that we're doing the story of Hagar because it spans essentially Parshat Lech Lecha and Parshat Vayera. So we're going to touch upon the story of Hagar, and hopefully I will reveal to you some fascinating aspects of Hagar. And let's get started. So we began last week, and those who have a Chumash and want to follow it, it's very easy. It's Parshat Perek Tet Zayin in Lech Lecha, the first pasuk, and there we are introduced to Hagar. And I'm going to read some psukim to you, so we stay relevant. Sarai, remember her name is not changed yet. It's still Sarai. Eshet Avram, lo yalda lo, did not bear any children to him. It's kind of a strange phrase, lo yalda lo, but we'll leave that for a moment. V'la shivcha mitzrit. She had a Egyptian shivcha, usually translated as a handmaid or maidservant, Ushma Hagar, whose name was Hagar. So right away, Rashi tells us something interesting because she's called a shivcha, but says Rashi, she is bat paro haita. We'll come back to that in a second, but she is a daughter of Paro. And what was she doing with Sarah? Remember that Paro had tried to abduct Sarah. She was, in a sense, miraculously freed from his clutches because Hashem intervened to put a kind of plague, well, that's a bad word to use these days, to put a kind of plague on the Egyptians and especially the royal house until Paro freed her. And so Paro saw this miraculous intervention by God, and he said, Mutav shetehei biti shivcha b'bayit zeh. Better my daughter should be a handmaid or a maidservant in the house of Avram and Sarah, v'lo gvira b'bayit acher, and not a princess anywhere else. So she is of high royal rank. We will come back to this phrase, this very powerful phrase, better to be a shivcha in the royal house of the Jewish people than a princess in the palace of the king. So it's interesting that, first of all, we know of another Bat Paro, right? A more famous Bat Paro, perhaps. And that, of course, is, well, we don't really have another name for her. We just call her Batya or Bitya, both of which mean daughter of God or daughter of the king. And we don't know her any other name for her. At least here we know Hagar. But this, of course, is the woman who saved Moshe, who eventually saved Am Yisrael. So she's a very important person, and obviously a very a very generous and praiseworthy person for what she did. So we're going to have a little bit of a point counterpoint between the two daughters of Paro. We'll do that later. So Sarah, of course, we know she is unable to have children. And indeed, the Gemara says, when it says, Sarah akara ein la valad, she is barren and can't have children, the Gemara says, why be repetitive? It answers, not that she was barren without a child, because that is indeed obvious. The Gemara says, ein la beit valad. She didn't even have a uterus. She had no ability to bear a child. That's why when she does give birth, that is truly an out and out miracle, but that's another story. But at this point, she's desperately wants to have children, and it appears she cannot. So she says, Ulai ibaneh mimena, perhaps I will be built up through Hagar. And there Rashi makes a very kind of dramatic statement that says that, why does it use this phrase, I will be built up, even though ibaneh can also mean I'll have a child through her. But Rashi says, if a woman doesn't have children, then not only are they not built up, ela harus, they're destroyed. I mean, this is a psychological comment that Rashi is making, that if a woman can't have a child, she always feels something is missing, and she's broken down in a very real sense. And so Sarai, or Sarah, is thinking, at least this way, okay, I'm not bearing the child, but I will be a surrogate mother. This is the first case of a surrogate mother that we know of. And in a sense, Sarah is saying it will be my child. The truth is that halachically, the majority opinion is that the religion of a child goes by the woman who delivers that child, who bears and delivers that child, not by the genetic material that may be provided. There is some dispute about this, but that's a generally accepted halacha, that if a Jewish woman delivers a child, that child's Jewish. And if a non-Jewish woman delivers a child, that child is non-Jewish and would then have to go through an adoption. But in any case, Avram does refer to Ishmael as his son. And so the Egyptians, of course, would consider, because obviously they were a very patriarchal society, and they would consider the child, just as the Muslims do today, that it is the father who determines the lineage or the status of the child, not the mother. So this is not that we ever held that, but Avram, it's interesting, and it's another discussion, that he considers this child really to be, in a sense, his own. And of course, he is the father. But, this plays into his reaction later. Okay, so Sarah takes Sarah, the wife of Avram. And by the way, we knew that already, didn't we? These verses and the text here is very, very revealing. And that's why I'm reading it to you, because it contains a lot of hidden messages. So here it says, Vatikach Sarai Eshet Avram. We know that Avram is her husband, but the pasuk wants to emphasize that just because, at least in Sarah's eyes, and in the eyes of God, we'll see, just because another woman bears a child for Avram, that doesn't qualify her as his wife. And to a great extent, Hagar is not identified as Avram's wife, but more as this surrogate mother, concubine, call her what you will. So she takes Hagar and gives her, Hagar is, according to most authorities, Hagar, in a sense, belongs to Sarah and not to both of them. That Paro had actually given Hagar to Sarah. So Sarah then owns, quote unquote, it's not politically correct to say that anybody owns anyone else, but that she owns Hagar and gives her to Avram. But she doesn't miketz eser shanim lashevet Avram be'eretz Canaan, only after the end of 10 years in Canaan. And Rashi points out, why is it, what does the 10-year figure mean? And Rashi says that this is the period of time stipulated that if a couple is married for 10 years and essentially, officially, the woman does not bear a child to that husband, Rashi says, chayav lisa acheret, then he must marry another woman. Now, I would qualify this is not the law today. There is a law that he can divorce her and marry another woman. And that ties in with whether or not she receives the amount that's specified in her ketubah. But I think today we would agree and say that there's no requirement to divorce the woman. And we see many great rabbis, the most famous of whom, by the way, who did not have a child but remained married to his wife for all of his life. Who are we talking about? We're talking about the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Lubavitcher Rebbe never had children. He certainly stayed with his wife for their entire marriage. And he did not seek at any point to have a new wife. There is another idea here that, and we see this later by the case of Rachel. Basically, that we're talking about 10 years. The Rashi says it here as well. 10 years in Israel. If a couple is married outside of Israel, and the commentators say, in this case, Avram lived elsewhere for a long period of time, obviously, before God said go to Israel. And so what does the 10 years mean? He was married for, 60 years. But they're saying if you lived outside of Israel and you didn't have a child, maybe you could say that was because you were living outside of Israel, and you shouldn't be. You should be in Israel. But if you come to Israel and for 10 years you're there and don't have a child, then it's an indication, that there must be some other reason. You can't pin it on the fact that you're living outside of Israel. And just another indication of how important it is to live in Israel, where Judaism comes to its fullest expression. So I go back for a moment that when Sarah comes up with this idea of being a surrogate, of having Hagar as a surrogate mother, the pasuk says, "Vayishma Avram lekol Sarai." Abraham listens to the voice of Sarah or Sarai. Notice that, and we'll see later, here he says, lekol Sarai. Later on, in Susie's favorite pasuk, he will say, bekol Sarai. Slightly tiny change from le to be. We'll get there. Okay, so this seems to, be the plan, and Avram has relations with Hagar, Batahar, and she becomes immediately pregnant. And Rashi points out to me, Bi'ah Rishonah, from the very first time that they have relations, Hagar immediately becomes pregnant. And the pasuk says, when she sees that she conceived, Vatekal Gevirta Be'ineha. So her mistress, Gevirta, she becomes lessened in her eyes. And Hagar basically says, who is the righteous woman here? Who is the tzaddiket? Clearly it's me. Sarah all these years could never get pregnant. I have relations one night with Avram and already I'm pregnant. So clearly there's something special about me. And it's even kind of implied in this word gevirta, which is almost indicating an equality. In other words, Hagar, who is a princess, is saying, and not just as we sometimes use it colloquially, she's a real princess. She is saying, you know what, Sarah, I'm pretty much every bit your equal. And we don't know exactly what she did or said, but the pasuk says that she did not show the proper respect to Sarah. And that obviously is not going to sit well with Sarah. So Sarah says to Avram that, something's wrong here. She says, Chamasi alecha, I'm mad at you. Why? I gave you my maidservant. And notice again, she calls her a shifcha. She doesn't say, I gave you Hagar, which might have been the more respectful thing to say. And what happened? Vatera kiharata ve'ikal beineha. When she became pregnant, I was basically, what word shall we use? Here it says, I was despised in her eyes, or I was made light of in her eyes. Yishpot Hashem beini uvenecha. Let God judge between me and you. Essentially saying that you're to blame for this. Maybe in the larger sense, because you didn't handle this well. You've got 2 wives now. And, that's a handful. One of the reasons, thank God we don't have polygamy. That's a handful to handle 2 wives. And basically, Sarah is saying, you didn't handle the situation well. Rashi points out something a little bit deeper. Rashi says that when Abraham went to God and said, when God is saying all the things he's going to give to Abraham to heap all kinds of favors and rewards on him, and Abraham said, what good is all that when I am childless? Manochi holech ariri, said Abraham. So Sarah says, why did you only talk about yourself? What about me? Why didn't you say we? What good are all these things you're giving me when we don't have a child? So you were only thinking of yourself. And had you mentioned me, so I would also be remembered. In other words, maybe even though it seems like there was nothing wrong with Abraham because he's fathering a child, maybe that was the result of his prayer. Maybe he and Sarah, even though the pasuk says that Sarah was barren, but maybe they both couldn't have children. But Abraham prayed and God answered, but he didn't include Sarah in his prayer. Okay, the answer to that maybe is, that she should have prayed too. But maybe Abraham has, sometimes people have a more powerful prayer. We see this by Rachel and Yaakov, that she wanted Yaakov to pray. And the Gemara says the prayer of a righteous person, the child of a righteous person, is more potent than the prayer of a righteous person whose parents were not righteous. So we kind of see that here. But she gets angry at Avram and she says, Ata chomes, this word chamasi alecha, I get angry. It also comes like chamas, from the word to steal or violence. Ata chomes mimeni, you stole from me. Also, shata shomea bizyoni v'shotek. You heard how distressed I was and you said nothing. Now we're going to see a lot of connections in this story to other stories. This is a throwback to the story of Adam and Chava, because when God punishes Adam and says, you listen to your wife, and I've talked about this in a Dvar Torah, this is one of my most favorite ideas. You don't see anywhere that Chava talks to Adam. So why does God say you listen to your wife? We don't see them speaking. So the answer is that Chava did speak, but not to Adam. She spoke to the snake. And Adam and the snake convinced her to take from the fruit, right, of the tree of knowledge. And says, God, you heard your wife talking to the snake. You should have saved her. You should have come to her aid right away and said, don't listen to that snake. and you didn't. And that's why Adam's punished. So Sarah, in a sense, is harking back to that same idea and saying to Avram, you heard Hagar treating me disdainfully, and you didn't say anything. So I'm mad at you. So Avram says, okay, you know what? She's your maidservant, and you go ahead and do what you want. Asila tov beinayich, do what you think is good. And then what happens? Vata'aneha Sarai, vativrach mipaneha. Sarah treats her harshly, and Hagar runs away. What does Sarah do to her? So Rashi says, Haita mishabedet ba b'koshi, that she gave her very, very hard menial work to do. Hagar, remember, was a princess, and to some extent would expect to be treated that way. Sarah doesn't treat her that way. It's interesting that and it uses this word mishabedet ba. We're going to come back to that later, but remember that word. Rashi says mishabedet ba b'koshi. She makes her work very hard work. There's a commentator that says, Medrash, that Sarah threw her shoes at her. Where have you seen this before? Have you seen in the Muslim world when they want to disgrace someone, they take off their shoes and they throw it at them? This is to this day a custom among Muslims. Basically, it's saying the shoe is the lowest article of clothes, the lowest part of your body. And they're basically saying, you're the lowest type of human being. I throw my shoe at you. And you can Google this. You'll see pictures of, in certain cases, where they take off their shoes by the hundreds and they throw it at somebody. Okay, well, so, by the way, the other comment we must make here is that this is the first instance in the Torah of what we call ayin hara, the evil eye. Exactly what it means, I'll give you my opinion in a moment, but Sarah casts an evil eye on Hagar, and as a result of that, Rashi says later that she miscarries. She's pregnant, she loses the child, and Ishmael will be born, but only from her second pregnancy. The ayin hara, it's such a difficult concept. We could devote a whole shiur to it. Is it really a spell that you cast on someone else? And does it have some mystical power? The evil eye, it sounds very devilish, but I mentioned to some, in another time when I spoke about this, that when I was a rabbi in Texas, one of the people, somebody called me up and said, Rabbi, I know there's a lot of very weird, strange customs in Judaism, but I heard about this one. I don't understand it. This canine hora, is that a dance of the dogs? Canine hora? Okay, true story, but it's a joke. Canine hora. Okay, but it is difficult to understand this idea of the ayin hara. I'll offer one thought, that ayin hara might not mean an evil eye, but a critical eye. Basically, when you focus on someone and you single them out, and indicated by staring at them, if they are experience some great success or something really good happened, and you kind of single them out, you might cause the powers above to look at that person and say, does this person really deserve all the good things that they're having? And you never want to be singled out. You never want the IRS or Mas Haknasat to pull your file. And you also don't want God to pull your file and say, let's go over carefully who this person is. Let's see if they really deserve everything they're getting. In a sense, I suggest that's, to me, the best explanation of the ayin hara. So therefore, we don't count people individually. We count them in a group only, because in a group, you're protected. There is safety in numbers. Okay, let's go on. So she escapes or runs away, Hagar, and an angel finds her. So we see that, and we'll see this elsewhere too, that she is able to converse with the angels, Hagar. And the angel says to her, where are you coming from? Where are you going? And there actually, Rashi says, is more than one angel there. She actually is able to evoke several angels. She says, I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai. And the angel says to her, go back there. V'hit ani tachat yadeha. Submit yourself to her, and she will take you back in. The angel says, don't worry, you're going to be rewarded. We know that you've been mistreated. You're going to have many generations come from you. They won't be able to be numbered. This is the same thing that's told to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Your children will be so many, like the stars of the sky or the sand on the shore. They won't be able to be counted. And that's what she's told also. And then she's told in advance, you'll have a child, and here's his name, Yishmael, which means God will hear. And you can look in the Parsha sheet. I have a little discussion why or should Jewish children be named Yishmael, but you can look at the Parsha sheet for that and ask the rabbi. And God has heard your affliction. So in a sense, the angel is saying you were mistreated. God has heard that, and you'll be rewarded, you'll be compensated, and you're going to have a child. Of course, it's not the greatest description, but Para Adam, he'll be a wild man. And in effect, Para Adam, the word Adam comes to qualify Para. He'll be a wild thing in the form of a man. Not that he'll be a man who is wild, but a wild creature in the form of a man. And we know, unfortunately, some of the barbarism that has been evidenced and been demonstrated by the descendants of Ishmael, the Arabs. But he will be a powerful figure. And she names the place El Roi. God has seen. And she says, Hagam halom ra'iti achrei Roi. Have I seen him here? In a sense, that she actually saw God. You can't say that about many people. And she sees God, she sees angels. Okay. And his name, he is born, his name is Yishmael. Abraham at that time is 86 years old. And that's part one of Hagar. Part two, we go to our own Parsha, the continuing story of Hagar. And there we are in, let me find it. We're in the Perek Chaf Aleph 21, Pasuk 9. And we come back to the story. This is now after the birth of Yitzchak. And there is a problem. Sarah sees the child at Ben Hagar HaMitzrit, Asher Yolda Avraham Mitzachek. She sees him Mitzachek, which usually means laughing. Well, first of all, note that she calls the child the son of Hagar, born to Abraham. She doesn't say the son of Hagar and Abraham. She doesn't really give Abraham, she doesn't want to admit or accept or acknowledge that he's the father. Of course, he is the father, but she doesn't want to connect the two. She uses the word mitzachek, and Rashi says very dramatically that mitzachek includes, it's a euphemism for the three cardinal sins, that this Yishmael, right, who's 13 years old, 14 years old, that he is committing committing idolatry, also gilui arayot, some form of immorality, it's not clear, and murder even, or attempted murder, because he shot arrows at Yitzchak and almost killed him, says Rashi. So that's pretty damning evidence. And she says, I want him out. She says to Avram, Garesha ta'amazot, get rid of this maidservant. It's clearly an insulting name. Ve'et b'na, and also her son. Ki lo yirash ben amazot im b'nim Yitzchak. No way are they going to split the inheritance. No way is this child Yishmael going to share the inheritance with my Yitzchak? And Abraham is not pleased by this. Vayarad davar mod b'nei Abraham. This is very bad in his eyes, alodot beno, on account of his son. Rashi says, well, that could be a double phrase, a double meaning on account of his son. It could mean he's troubled by the fact that his son is committing all these sins. Or it could mean that he's very, very unhappy with Sarah's demand that he be kicked out of the house, because, and he therefore it pointedly calls Yishmael Beno his son. He considers Yishmael his son. It's interesting, just as an aside, these Abrahamic accords that we have with the United Arab Emirates, based on the fact that we have this joint ancestor, Abraham. It was a very, very insightful and clever and spectacular name that they gave these accords to Abrahamic, going back to this pasuk where Abraham says, he's my son. And, I don't really want to kick him out of the house. So God has to intervene. And God says, don't let this be upsetting to you. But kol asher tomari lecha Sarah shma bikola. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her voice. Now here you see, it said before likola and here bikola. I suggest that Rashi says that this means Sarah had greater insight and the gift of prophecy than did Abraham. Bikola, the word bin means in, like babayit, in the house. It's a kind of an inner voice that she understood in the greater scheme of things, the big picture, the problems that would have resulted had Yishmael stayed in that house. He had to leave. Maybe he would have been a bad influence on Yitzchak. Maybe Yishmael would have killed him. But Sarah sees the bigger picture more than Abraham does. And God says, listen to her. She knows what she's talking about. And she has the right vision. So, and God says to Avram to kind of appease him, but don't worry, he's going to be a great nation also. Kizarachahu. He emphasizes, he's your seed. We're not saying, like you might say about a surrogate mother, she doesn't really have any connection. No, Hagar is clear, Ishmael is clearly connected to you, says God to Abraham. So he gets up early in the morning, he takes them out to the desert, he gives water to Hagar, and he puts the child on her shoulder. Now, this is a bit strange, of course, and Rashi right away is wondering, he's 14 years old, so maybe she should be on his shoulder. Why is he on her shoulder? So Rashi points out, once again, Ichnisa bosar ayin ra'ah, she put an ayin hara on him, and the sun struck him and somehow injured him, so he was unable to walk. So Sarah's pretty vengeful and pretty extreme in her attitude. You would think that she would want him to walk so they could get away, but no, she has put an ayin hara, and she leaves. Rashi says she goes back to her ways of idolatry. And then we have this famous incident that we read about on Rosh Hashanah, which basically is read on Rosh Hashanah to remind us that God hears all prayers. And they go back into the desert and they run out of water. That's a whole other story. Why? Because why didn't Abraham give them enough water? But we won't go into that. There's a lot of commentaries on that. And Hagar kind of distances herself because she says, I can't bear to see this child die. But she prays, and Vatisad Kola Batev, she prays, she lifts up her voice and she cries. Remember, the best prayers are the prayers that cause you to cry. It shows that you're sincere. Unless you're a Hollywood actress or actor, you probably can't just immediately bring tears. God listens, but then it says something interesting. By Shema Elokim et Kol Hanar. He listens to the boy. It doesn't say anywhere that Ishmael was praying. It says that she was praying. And So God hears that voice. Some want to say that it's not necessarily Ishmael, but it's the childlike nature of her prayer. When you pray in purity and innocence like a child, God hears that. Just bare your soul and admit that you need God like a helpless child, and God will answer you. Others want to say, no, he actually heard Ishmael, that apparently Ishmael was crying and praying, and says, what's wrong? And says, and here God speaks to her. This is, again, not a simple thing that God speaks to somebody, but he does speak to her and says, don't worry. God has heard the voice of the boy, Asher Husham, in the place where he is. And Rashi points out something very important that says that God judges you where you are at any moment. If you are sincere, we say this about someone who converts. If they're sincere at the moment of their conversion, later on, maybe they go astray. It doesn't matter. They're Jewish. If they were sincere at that moment that they said, I want to be Jewish, Shema Yisrael, go in the mikvah, whatever it may be, then that's what counts. This is plays and connects to another story. We're seeing a lot of connections here. And that connects to the story of Yonah and Nineveh, because Yonah says, I see in my vision that although you have commanded me, God, to ask Nineveh to repent, this is what we read, of course, on Yom Kippur at the end in the Mincha, but Yonah says, they're not sincere. I see that they're going to go right back to their evil ways. And therefore, when his prayer, Yonah says, he calls God El Rachum V'Chanun, Erech Apayim Rav Chesed. He leaves off the emet, the truth. He says, the truth is these people don't deserve to be saved. And God says, you know what? Right now, at this moment, they are sincere, and that's enough for me. And Rashi points this out and says, a very important point. If at that moment you're sincere, that's what God hears. He doesn't take into consideration, although he knows the future, what you're going to do later. Well, so God saves them, and she opens her eyes and sees a well of water. That's another idea. The water was always there, but God causes her to see it. Salvation is always there. You just got to see it. She gives Ishmael to drink, and they don't get back together, but Ishmael grows up, Vayigdal, he lives in the wilderness, he becomes an archer, and then Vatikach lo imo isha me'eretz Mitzrayim, Hagar marries an Egyptian. We don't know who. It just says, that Ishmael marries an Egyptian, and essentially begins his lineage. I want to mention that although this is the end of almost the end, there's a postscript about Hagar. The next episode is where Avimelech, who is the captain, and Pichol, the captain of his army, they come to Abraham. He's going to make a treaty with them. And very pointedly, Avimelech says to Abraham, I want you to swear that you will not deal falsely with me or with my son. Clearly, this is a connection to this story where he knows what happened. And Abraham, in a sense, betrayed or was made to betray his son. And Abimelech points that out and says, I know what you did to your son. You basically double-crossed him. And I don't want you to do that to me. And I strongly feel that that's the connection between the next episode. There is a postscript, and the postscript comes later on when Sarah passes away. That's found in Perek Chaf Hey, that Abram goes back. A man should never be alone. He marries Keturah, and say most of the commentators, Keturah is actually Hagar. He calls back Hagar. The Medrash says she never had relations with anyone else during that time that they were separated, takes her back. She's called Keturah. The Meforshim say from the word mikuteret, perfumed, that she was, not just sweet smelling, but in the sense, or from the word ketoret, connected, ketura, ketoret, that she was a good person, a person who was blessed. And, the ketoret brings reward, and she was the person who administered the ketoret offering, the incense. The reward was wealth, and that she was, in a sense, given this prize of Abraham, and goes back and is married to him. The story of Hagar, then, to try to sum up in our last couple of minutes, it's a mixed bag. She could be seen as someone who let this go to her head, and someone who, had got her comeuppance because she trifled with Sarah, who was really the tzaddiket. And as a result of that, maybe it was a bad influence on her son, and he didn't grow up right. And maybe she's to blame for the fact that he had to be excluded from Abraham's home. On the other hand, Abraham clearly sees something noble in this daughter of Paro, just like we saw the other daughter of Paro, who was a noble lady. Here too, Abraham senses that she was true. Sarah was his soulmate, and Sarah was the one who he needed to be with and bear this child, Yitzchak, that would carry on the lineage, and not Ishmael. But Abraham recognized there was something special, and so he took her back and had, by the way, more children with her. He had several more children with Keturah Hagar later in life. But I think one of the points that I want to leave you with is that point Rashi is trying to tell us, and that is the things we do in life, and especially the things that were done by the Avot and Imahot, they cast a long shadow. Remember, we saw before that Sarah humbled Hagar and, in a sense, disrespected her royal lineage and made her work all kinds of menial work, as it says, mishabedet. That's clearly connected to the word mishubad or eved. And there are commentaries who say, because Sarah made Hagar work this menial servitude, that's one of the reasons why the Jewish people had to become slaves in Egypt and were given all of these menial, almost useless jobs to do as slaves. So because she humbled the Egyptian princess, Egypt would come to humble us. There are other reasons, of course. The sin of the brothers against Joseph is another reason for the slavery in Egypt. But clearly, Rashi and others are inferring that what Sarah did to Hagar would come back to haunt us. It's very similar to another story we'll see later, and that is the story of Esav. Esav's grandson is Amalek. Esav has a son, Eliphaz, who marries his concubine, whose name was Timnah. And Timnah wants to get closer to God and to the Jewish people. She asks to be converted by first Abraham, then Yitzchak, then Yaakov. All three turned her down. And as a result of that insult and refusal, she bears this Amalek, who becomes the perennial archenemy of the Jewish people, perhaps to avenge his mother, who was treated so disdainfully by the Avot. So there has to be a connection. In other words, the things that happen to us are never imposed on us. They come as a result of our own actions, our own mistakes that we make, or the good things we do. And here we see this running through so many stories. The story of Moshe and the daughter of Paro, and the story of Adam and Chava, and so on and so forth. But also this idea that Sarah's mistreatment of Hagar would come back to haunt us, just like the rejection of the Avot to Timnah would also result in Amalek becoming our eternal enemy. So this story is very potent. The story of Hagar, she's not a simple person. It's not a simple story. It ties together a lot of other incidents in the Torah. And I think the lasting lesson, and indeed, as we said before, the name Keturah connected to the word Ketoret, and also connected to another word that indicates that she refused to have relations with anyone else until ultimately she came back to Abraham and had a number of children with him. But in the interim, she would not marry and she would not have intimacy with any man. And that's also a connection to the word Keturah, that she stayed chaste or celibate until Abraham. So Abraham takes her back, which may be kind of the final comment, that he considered her to be a righteous person in her own right. And she therefore becomes this counterpoint to us of having the lineage also of a great nation, the Arab nation, and again, so contemporary today, the hope that this Abrahamic Accord may signal perhaps there will be a refusing of the family connection through Abraham between the Jewish people and the Arabs. And maybe we will, in the future, have a much more congenial, even harmonious relationship with them. So I wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. I guess if anybody wants to unmute yourself and ask a question, you can. It's, I think, a very fascinating portrait of Hagar, and she's not a minor person, as it turns out. Her story is an important story. Next week, I think we'll stay at 5 o'clock. We're going to change the week after Chaya Sarah. We're going to change on that Saturday night. We're going to move the clocks back, so 5 o'clock won't be good. I think at that point we'll go to 6 o'clock. That way, anybody who needs to daven mincha, 5 o'clock will not interrupt them. You'll be able to daven mincha, and certainly you'll be done well before 6 o'clock. So everybody have a Shabbat Shalom. And next week, the title, my favorite title for any shiur, You've Lost That Lavan Feeling. We'll talk a bit about Lavan, and also a fascinating kind of, what do you call those character actors? Someone who's not at center stage, but somebody who plays a part, and it fits into the whole scheme. It wouldn't be the same movie or play without them. Everybody, wishing you well.